Welcome to Jefferson's West, Lewis, Clark, and Native Americans Summer Series. Hi, I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Today's lecture is Lewis and Clark, an overview of the expedition by Alan Taylor. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. This series includes 4 talks and a panel discussion. If you haven't registered for all of the programs in this series and your schedule now permits, please visit the Lifetime Learning website at alumni.virginia.edu/learn to register. Thank you for submitting questions in advance of this program. Should you have another question during the program, kindly add it to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Today's program is being recorded and will be available in a week or so in the Lifetime Learning's podcast library. Also, live captioning is available should you need it during this program today. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker and the lead faculty for the Jefferson's West, Lewis and Clark, and Native American series. Alan Taylor is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History in the UVA Corcoran Department of History in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. He's a graduate of Colby College and he received his PhD in American History from Brandeis University. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Early American History and Culture in Williamsburg, Virginia, he taught at Boston University and then the University of California at Davis. Alan Taylor has published 10 books. That's right, 10 books. I won't name them all, but several are award-winning publications, including William Cooperstown, which won the Bancroft Beveridge and Pulitzer Prizes. The Internal Enemy won the Pulitzer Prize for American History. American Colonies won the 2001 Gold Medal for Nonfiction from the Commonwealth Club of California. The Civil War of 1812 won the Empire State History Prize and was the finalist for the George Washington Prize. His most recently released books are The American Republics, A Continental History of the United States from 1783 to 1850. This was just published this spring, 2021. And Thomas Jefferson's Education, which was published in 2019. Alan gave a great talk for the Lifetime Learning program just 2 years ago on that book. It's not a mystery why we selected Alan Taylor as our lead faculty for this program on Lewis and Clark. He is quite knowledgeable about this topic and well-connected around the country. All of the speakers in this series came highly recommended by him. Alan, thank you so much for speaking today and moderating the discussions we will have throughout the Jefferson's West, Lewis, Clark, and Native American series. Audience, I hope you have found a comfortable place to view this lecture. Sit back, relax, and enjoy learning. Alan, the microphone is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Althea, for all of your help here. I want to welcome all of you who are participating and showing your support for Lifetime Learning and for the University of Virginia. I've been thinking about Lewis and Clark, it seems like my whole life. As a child, I was very interested in the West, even though I grew up in the easternmost state, the state of Maine. Fascination with the West, and in particular the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I've had the good fortune over the years as a historian to meet some very fine historians, and I could not have asked for a better set of colleagues to join me in this enterprise. So you will later be hearing from Ann Hyde and Colin Calloway and Elizabeth Fenn. And we will be doing a wrap-up panel together, which I'm very much looking forward to. So the Lewis and Clark expedition is very much associated with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, both a man of science and a man of politics, a great intellectual, someone connected to the leading minds of Europe, somebody with a vision of progressive knowledge unfolding and in developing mankind's full potential. And the Lewis and Clark expedition certainly fits right into that. But it also fits into the geopolitics of the time. Jefferson is a very savvy geopolitician. And so to start out, I just want to put the Lewis and Clark expedition into that consideration of what's going on in the wider world, and why does the Lewis and Clark expedition take the particular form that it did. And so the first thing to remind ourselves of is that the United States is not the first set of non-native peoples to occupy the West Coast. The Spanish had established a set of missions along the coast of Alta California, and they had a much longer presence, of course, on the Pacific coast of Mexico to the south. The Spanish established these missions and presidios in order to stake a claim to that territory, not because they so much valued California per se, but because they wanted to keep other powers away from Mexico. So the number of Spanish colonists is relatively small, but it's something that is in the back of everybody's mind. The Spanish for centuries claimed the Pacific to be their lake, even though the Pacific covers about a third of the Earth's surface. Other European powers were breaking into the Pacific, however, especially during the 18th century. They are sending official expeditions of exploration. Britain sent this man, Captain James Cook. And James Cook will make 3 voyages in which he will systematically crisscross the Pacific Ocean. And he is a very skilled cartographer and navigator, and he keeps very detailed journals recording his measurements and his observations. And so this will be an expedition which is unprecedented in the factual level of information and the publication of this information. The Spanish had been in the habit of keeping information secret, thinking that that was the key to power, to controlling the Pacific. But Cook and the British have the opposite conclusion, which is you need to publicize what you find out in order to stake the claim that you deserve a share in whatever resources can be extracted. So this is presented as pure science, but in fact, it's not pure science. It's a competition of empires for prestige. It's a competition of empires for access to resources that may have economic value and that might tip the military balance, because all of these European powers, Spain and France and Britain, are engaged in a competition in the world's oceans for primacy. And so Cook and the British government tell the Spanish, this is just for pure science's sake, and the Spanish say, right. But it turns out that Cook and the British are right, that by publicizing what Cook is finding, that other European powers are inclined to accept Britain's claims to be in the forefront of exploring the Pacific, even though Britain is coming to this game more than 2.5 centuries after the Spanish had first probed the Pacific. Now, Cook brings along professional scientists on his voyage. So this isn't just a naval expedition, but there are also scientists, including this man who was on the first voyage. He's Sir Joseph Banks. And if any of you read the Patrick O'Brian novels, you will be familiar with Banks. He makes a cameo appearance as something of a spy master in the British Empire during the Napoleonic Wars. Well, we're looking at Banks much earlier in his life, when he is a botanist, and he's being brought along in this expedition because the range of information that explorers want to know and that governments want to know has dramatically increased over the centuries. And these are very much men of the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that is premised on the notion that knowledge is progressive, that we need to transcend tradition and we need to learn from observation and experimentation new knowledge. And Banks and Cook and Thomas Jefferson are all members of this emerging tradition we call the Enlightenment. This is Cook's first voyage, and you see he focuses on the South Pacific. And he will probe the coast of Australia, for example, and it will lead some 20 years later to the foundation of the first British colony in Australia at Botany Bay, which will happen in 1788. So the British are developing a real interest in the Pacific as a corner of the world that's less well known, that is potentially rich in resources, and they're fearful of the French getting involved in there and making something of a comeback at British expense. Now, this is Cook's third voyage, which he makes during the middle of the 1770s. And this will take him to the coast of North America. He will also go to the Hawaiian Islands, both going and coming. He will not complete the voyage because he'll be killed in the Hawaiian Islands on his return voyage. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, he encounters very complex and old cultures of native peoples who have adapted to this very rainy environment, very rich in wood. And here is the interior of a chief's lodge. You can see the types of wood carvings done there, and then also all of the drying fish. Fish is very important to the diet of people living in the Pacific Northwest. And they are not united as one people. There are many different nations speaking different languages and engaged in a competition that is often violent with one another. But they have access to the pelts of sea otters. And these pelts are very valuable as furs, particularly if you can take them to China, where the Chinese are just crazy for sea otter pelts and will exchange very large quantities of goods that are valuable back in Europe. So this is something that Cook's mariners discover on their return voyage. They go to Hawaii. Cook unfortunately killed there in a conflict with native peoples of the Hawaiian Islands. The voyagers go to China, they trade these sea otter pelts, and they get essentially a fortune in silks and porcelains, which they take to Britain and sell and make a great profit. Well, this then inspires a whole spate of commercial voyages that will go around the world to bring European manufactured goods to the people of the Pacific Northwest, to obtain sea otter pelts, take them to China, obtain Chinese goods, and bring them to Europe or to the Northeast of the United States. So these kind of circumnavigation voyages, which had been very, very few and had been government sponsored prior to the 1780s, become a commercial commonplace during the 1780s. And at the coast, the west coast of North America, California on up Pacific coast of what's now Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska, becomes very well known on maps and is regarded as commercially a very valuable territory. This shows one of the chiefs of the named Makina, who is the leader of the Moachat, and they lived at a place called Nootka on Vancouver Island. And he's quite a compelling, powerful character in his corner of the world. And you can see a British vessel in the background. Now, one of the first American ships to go to that corner of the world is named the Columbia. And it's under Captain Robert Gray. You see it's flying the American flag. And the canoes of people are assembling around it in order to trade. Because the people of the Pacific Northwest are very keen to get metal goods. Even a nail would carry great value because iron and steel have a cutting value that far exceeds the stone and the shell tools that they were used to. Now, the River Columbia, which separates Washington State from Oregon State, is named after Gray's vessel. And it becomes a primary way in which Americans start to lay claim that they deserve a share of the Pacific Northwest. Now, despite the very detailed knowledge of the Pacific coast, knowledge of the interior beyond the Missouri River, in other words, between the Missouri River and approximately North Dakota, further on west to the Pacific coast, that interior, which is on the order of a quarter of the continent, is really largely unknown to non-native peoples. And here is a map that's done before the Lewis and Clark expedition, and it shows the kind of wishful thinking that blossomed, because there is a very wishful hope that you could get from St. Louis, go up the Missouri River, and it was known that there were some mountains to the west called the Shiny Mountains. But the hope was that they would be very narrow and relatively low, that they'd be the counterpart of the Appalachians, but maybe even a little narrower. And here on this map, it looks very convenient that it looks like a little hillock you could assemble. You could go up, ascend during the morning, and then come down in the afternoon, and you're practically at the Pacific coast. So the distance is shortened and the obstacles are treated as minor. Now, in part, this is because fur traders and other explorers on the upper Missouri would ask leading questions of natives. They would say, are there mountains to the west? Natives say, sure. Those mountains are quite low, aren't they? Natives would say, sure, whatever you say. And so this enters into writings and enters into maps. And this is an operative assumption. And this is going to be one of the things that will inspire the Lewis and Clark expedition, is the hope that these shiny mountains, or what we now call the Rockies, will be low, that they'll be easy to get through, and that once you're on the other side, you'll be pretty close to the Pacific. Now, the first man to test this theory is not an American, but it is Alexander McKenzie. Now, he's an American in the sense that his family were loyalists who had fled from the American Revolution and settled in Canada. He became involved in the fur trade and is posted out there in the heart of the Canadian Arctic Shield. And he learns that there are rivers that flow out of something called the Great Slave Lake. And one river in particular, and he thinks that this may flow westward into the Pacific and would bring him very close to Captain Cook's world. And he tries it in 1789, and that's the blue line that's indicated, and you see his disappointment. It takes him north into the Arctic Ocean, which was largely blocked by ice year round. This is long before global warming, so this is a very forbidding discovery, and he's very disappointed. But he'll try in 1793 going up a different river, whereas he'd been able to go down the river named for him, the Great McKenzie River. He goes up a river that flows into Lake Athabasca. Very difficult passage through the mountains, but eventually reaches the Pacific. Does this in 1793. Carves this stone, which is still there. And then will make his way slowly back to Montreal, which was his home base, and then on to London, where he publishes a book and encourages the British Empire to establish forts and trading posts along the Pacific coast, and says, you've got to do this because the Americans will come and occupy that territory if you don't. And this is a very valuable fur trade that you want to control for the British Empire. Publishes the book in 1801. And the book makes quite clear how difficult the journey had been for Mackenzie. So it's not really a commercially viable route. But the British could get to that coast, as Cook had shown, going by sea. And but the British government had its hands full in 1801. It's involved in warfare against Napoleon's France. And it's got other business to attend to in India. And the East India Company is not open-minded about a new commercial enterprise competing in the trade with China. So Mackenzie's proposal goes nowhere with the British government. But the most avid reader of it all is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson gets his hands on a copy, and he assumes the worst of the British at all times. So he assumes the British indeed are going to establish these forts. And it makes him quite keen to act on his very long-standing hope for a scientific expedition that will go overland from the United States to the Pacific Ocean. Again, this is what the geographic knowledge of the time suggested, that the Rocky Mountains were remarkably close to the headwaters of the Missouri. They were low. They looked like there were nice passes through them. Here is a map that shows the Louisiana Purchase, which Napoleon's France had acquired, essentially at gunpoint, from the Spanish. And then for a variety of reasons, Napoleon had lost interest in this acquisition and had decided he would offer it for sale to the United States. But at the time the expedition starts, when Jefferson is seeking permission from Congress and funding from Congress, the United States had not yet acquired Louisiana and was not at all certain that it would do so. Indeed, in all likelihood, it would not be acquired by the United States at the time that Jefferson authorized the expedition. So the expedition is crossing into territory where it's not really welcomed by the imperial power that claims it, which is a combination of Spain and France. And it's a world of native peoples. Now, by the time the expedition actually gets going into this territory, the purchase will have happened, and so much of the expedition will occur within territory claimed by the United States, as far west as the headwaters of the Missouri River. Now, Thomas Jefferson is a very creative guy, and he wants to stretch the Louisiana Purchase to include the West Coast, but everybody knows that's a stretch. But the territory it's uncertain who among the imperial powers has the best claim to that territory between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. Spain clearly has occupied the coast of California. Britain and America have sent commercial voyages all over the coast of the Pacific Northwest, but neither the British nor the Americans have established permanent trading posts as of 1801. In 1803 is when the expedition starts, and it's also the time of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, to lead this expedition, Thomas Jefferson wants somebody he can trust. He doesn't appoint a scientist. He appoints a military man who has grown up in Albemarle County as a family friend of Jefferson's family. His name is Meriwether Lewis, and he has served as Jefferson's confidential secretary in the early years of his presidency. And at that time, being secretary is like being chief of staff. So if Jefferson is to pick somebody he truly trusts for a very sensitive mission that's not just scientific, but is also geopolitical and is military, he's going to pick Meriwether Lewis. Now, Lewis knows it's a daunting assignment, and he wants a friend to go along with him as the co-commander. And he picks a friend who is not that well known to Jefferson. His name is William Clark. And technically, William Clark is a subordinate in that he's a lieutenant while Meriwether Lewis is a captain. Now, this is a fact that's kept from the men in the expedition who are told that he's Captain Clark, and that it's a joint command. Now, that's very rare in the military world. And what is much more common in that time is for military officers to squabble over rank and to squabble over priorities. But these two men worked famously well together, and is part of the secret to the success of the expedition. Now, woolly mammoths, you're saying, what did woolly mammoths have to do with this expedition? Well, Thomas Jefferson gives a very long wish list of information to keep their eyes open for. And it includes the possibility that there are woolly mammoths that still live. Now, nobody's seen one, but they found plenty of bones of woolly mammoths in the eastern United States, and especially in the Ohio Valley. So Thomas Jefferson says, keep your eyes open. Now, this is not, of course, Jefferson's prime purpose in sending the expedition out there. His prime purpose is to lay down a marker in this game of claiming the Pacific Northwest, to say that the United States has aspirations to expand to the Pacific and wants in on this trade with China and doesn't want to be excluded from it. And in order to achieve a route that would be secure and would be commercially viable via the Missouri River, they also want Lewis and Clark to gather information about Native peoples and to establish peaceful ties with the Native peoples along the route. So those are the prime goals of this expedition. And at this point, there's a poll question, which I think Ashley is going to provide to all of you, that covers the first part of this presentation. So the question is, what was Jefferson's main goal in sending the Lewis and Clark expedition? And you have three choices. One is convert the Indians to Christianity. Two is to find the woolly mammoths on the Great Plains. And three is compete with the British for access to the Pacific coast and the trade with Asia. Okay, people have been paying attention. This is great. The math doesn't quite add up. We got 102% here. But that this is a bid to compete with the British is very important. So just to emphasize that sometimes the Lewis and Clark expedition is cast as a trip out into the great unknown. And part of the route is the great unknown to people of the United States. Of course, it's not the great unknown to the native peoples who lived there. But the area between the upper Missouri River and the Pacific coast is terra incognita from an American perspective, meaning Americans of the United States. But the coast that they're going to, the Pacific coast, is very well known and it's understood to be well visited. So Thomas Jefferson's instructions include the option for Lewis and Clark, if they found that returning overland would be too difficult, look for one of the ships along the coast and then just try to catch a ride back that way. Well, they don't take that option. They come back overland, as we'll see. Now, the first year of the expedition is just to establish a base camp at St. Louis. And they really get going in the spring of 1804. And throughout this expedition, they're going to move in the warm months and they're going to hunker down in the winter. Very good reasons for this. It's given the technology of the time, it's very hard and very dangerous to move about in the winter if you're up on the northern Great Plains, or especially if you're in the Rocky Mountains. So they need to get going early in the spring of 1804 and get up the Missouri River as far as they can go. And where they want to go is something that's reasonably well known because fur traders have been visiting it for many decades, and that's a cluster of villages known as the Mandan villages. They're actually a cluster of 3 people who live there that get along most of the time and have a similar way of life, living in permanent villages with fields of corn, beans, and squash, palisades around their villages. They're the Hidatsa, Arikara, and the Mandans, especially the Mandans. All of these people had developed pretty good relationships with fur traders coming up the river from St. Louis or coming down from Hudson's Bay far to the north, where British fur traders were operating out of the Hudson's Bay Company. Or some fur traders coming down from Canada via Montreal and then the Great Lakes and Lake Superior. So the Mandan villages are something of a crossroads for trade and different native peoples. So 1804, that's the first goal. This is a map that shows the St. Louis of the time. It's in the lower left inset. You can see it's quite a small village, overwhelmingly of francophones of French descent, newly acquired by the United States. Very few American officials newly arrived there in 1804. Now, going up the river, one of the great challenges is they have to go through territory that is dominated by native peoples who don't like the Mandans, don't like the Hidatsa, are engaged in warfare with them. So what they don't like to see is people going up the river from St. Louis with a lot of guns, because they feel those people are going up to trade guns to the Mandans and the Hidatsa and the Arikara, and that will make those peoples more formidable opponents. Now, of course, the peoples in between, who we come to call the Lakota, sometimes they're called the Sioux, there are a variety of tribes within this broad confederacy, but they're going to be not cooperative. Now, they never come right out and attack the Lewis and Clark expedition, but they try to intimidate Lewis and Clark into turning around, or they try to shake them down to give them a share of their guns, because these native peoples would like to have more guns. So there's some very tense moments, and here's a modern artist capturing one of those moments that nearly leads to a firefight between the Lakota and the Corps of Discovery, which is the name for this group of people, who are mostly US Army soldiers. There's 30 enlisted men, 5 NCOs, and 2 officers, Lewis and Clark. And then along the way, there are a handful of civilians that go along, mostly French Canadians, who are boatmen or they're skilled hunters and guides. Now, this shows a more successful discussion with the Lakota along the river. And this, again, is a modern artist, a 20th century artist. And this is quite striking for the conspicuous presence of York, who was the only African-American member of the expedition. He's not in the military. At that time, the military did not allow African-Americans to serve. But he's armed. He is William Clark's enslaved servant. He was born in 1799 in Virginia and belonged to Clark's father and is inherited by William Clark when his father dies in 1799. So I said York was born in 1799, he was born in 1770. So he and William Clark are actually about the same age, and they grew up as playmates. But as they both become adults, then it is made painfully evident to York that he's a slave. Now that status will become more murky on this expedition, where he is treated as on a par with the privates in the expedition and will even be allowed to vote on a critical issue that was put to a vote of the men. And comes and goes pretty freely and has a firearm and engages in hunting, and is prepared if any of these confrontations with Native peoples like the Lakota might in fact turn deadly. And he will come back from the expedition assuming that he's become a free man, which turns out not to be William Clark's understanding. Mandan villages painted by George Catlin in the 1830s. And you can see their earth lodges clustered together, surrounded by a palisade. So when the expedition gets there, they're greatly relieved. They will build a fort nearby. They will stay there. They get along famously with the Mandans. We're delighted to see them, with the reasoning that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They understand that the Lakota and this expedition have been a bit at odds. The expeditioners are delighted to be with the Mandans. They trade very happily with them and spend a winter that goes very well. This is Meriwether Lewis, a painting made a few years later after the return of the expedition, and it shows him wearing a robe given to him by the Mandans. This is that robe which still survives. And you see it belonged happily to the Mandans, and it is a description of certain historical events in their past. And it's given to Lewis and Clark as a present. And in return, the Lewis and Clark expedition are providing weapons and gunpowder and other trade goods that are valued by the Mandans. So my point here is that Indians aren't one happy people who all are united against the United States. Some of them see an advantage to them in developing trade relations with this new power that's coming into this world. And other Native peoples are much more skeptical of the American presence. Now, the most important thing that happens in the Mandan villages is that Lewis and Clark learn that there is a young woman named Sacagawea who originated among the Shoshone people who lived in the Rocky Mountains at the headwaters of the Missouri. And that is the most pivotal place that Lewis and Clark need information about, and where they will especially need an interpreter who can speak Shoshone. Now, she was captured as a young girl by Hidatsas and brought to the Mandan villages, where they sold her to a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, and becomes one of his native wives. Now, the expedition to get Sacagawea to go with them has to hire her husband. They don't have a very high estimation of Toussaint Charbonneau. but they have a very high estimation of Sacagawea. And she starts to pay dividends immediately when they get in motion again in 1805 to go up the Missouri River, because they continue to pass through native territories. And to have a woman is a signal of peace. One of the reasons why the Lewis and Clark expedition had difficulty in 1804 was no women, and native people see that and they conclude war party. Whereas if you're bringing along at least one woman, then that's an indication you're coming in peace. So Lewis and Clark don't have nearly the difficulties in 1805 that they'd had in 1804, and a key element of that is Sacagawea. So just to recapitulate, 1803 is established the base camp. 1804 is get up the Missouri River to the Mandan villages to spend the winter. Then in 1805, this is the key year. This is when they got to get up to they got to find the headwaters of the Missouri River. They got to get up into the Rockies. Going to have some native people show them a way through, hopefully provide them with horses, because once they get to the upper Missouri, they're not going to be able to use their boats anymore. You're going to have to go overland. And they're going to try to find the Columbia River, and then they'll build new boats there and go down the Pacific. That's the plan. But it all hinges on finding a route through the Rocky Mountains with the help of native peoples. And they're racing against the seasons again, because they've got to get into the Rockies by August. Why? Well, because winter can come very early in the high elevations of the Rockies. And if you get trapped up there by heavy snows, just think the Donner Party. The Donner Party didn't yet exist as an example, but that's what can happen to people who are trapped in the upper Rockies. So if you're going to get over the Rockies, you got to get over them, let's say at the latest, you're pushing your luck if it's the end of September. They have Misadventures with Bears. It's rather quaint. It looks like a Newfoundland dog. There was a Newfoundland dog, on the, by the way, on this expedition. It belonged to Meriwether Lewis. His name was Seaman. This was not meant to be a dog. This is meant to be a grizzly bear who has chased this member of the expedition up a tree. This is a more apt look at the grizzly bear. And up in Missouri, a lot of grizzly bears. And the expedition tries to shoot them and puts a lot of bullets into them, and they were very slow to die. And after that, the expeditioners say, you probably should avoid these bears. Now, I'm missing something here. Well, some images didn't quite make it. So anyway, I will cut to the chase through the Rocky Mountains. Happy news. Sacagawea recognizes the headwaters as familiar to her from her childhood. And through an extremely lucky break, they make contact with a band of the Shoshone led by her brother, Kamehameha. And the Shoshone were very skittish people because they were used to people coming from the east coming to engage in slave raids on them. The Shoshone were at a disadvantage because they didn't have any guns, because they didn't have a European trading partner. They lived far to the west of the Mandan villages. The people living around the Mandan villages, particularly the Hidatsa, would go to the headwaters of the Missouri to seize women and children from the Shoshone. But other people are doing this as well, and they include the Blackfeet, who are engaged in trade relations with the Hudson's Bay Company. So Kamehameha is, once he realizes that you can trust the Lewis and Clark expedition, after all, his sister is a key member of it, and they're willing to trade with him and provide him with some weapons. Okay, we're here to be your best friends. And they show them the way through the mountains, link them up with the Nez Perce Indians who lived just to the west, who had plenty of spare horses. And that enables them to get through the Rocky Mountains just in the nick of time and get to the Pacific, to the Columbia River, and then they descend the river. And this is a painting done in the very early 20th century by Charles Russell. And it shows in the vessel in the foreground, it's Sacagawea using a sign language to communicate with people of the Pacific Northwest. there was something of a simplified sign language that's used in the fur trade in that corner of the world that enables different linguistic groups to communicate with one another. The Lewis and Clark expedition will have a good relationship with the natives around them, who are known as the Katzops, at the mouth of the river. And the expedition would build a fortified base for them to spend the winter, which they called Fort Katzop. This is a reconstruction of it because the original Fort Katzop rotted away a very long time ago, but it's now a National Park Service. The winter there was one that was, they found unpleasant because it rained all the time. In 3 months, there were only 12 days without rain. Also, there wasn't much meat around, and these were young American men of that time who were used to eating prodigious quantities of meat and had been in good fortune when they were on along the Missouri River, where there were plenty of buffalo to hunt. But when they get to this corner of the world, what people live on is salmon. Now, this is the world's greatest salmon. But these guys just complain bitterly about 3 months of eating salmon. Now, we've gotten them through 1803, 1804, 1805. They reached their destination, the Pacific. They've been gathering information, taking measurements, recording these journals, all following the template established first by Captain Cook, and then next by Alexander McKenzie, because the whole goal is to return with certain select items, lots of information, and to publish a very detailed map and very detailed journals in order to compete with the British as being in the vanguard of science in service to their nation. Now, 1806 is going to be fairly straightforward because they know where they're going now. Going up the Columbia River is pretty tough because you're going up the Columbia and the Snake Rivers, and that's not easy. And then you got to get through the Rockies. Okay, but you're on the other side of the Rockies and it's summer, and now you're on the Missouri River and it's just float on down. So you wave at the Mandans as you go by, and you'll get back to St. Louis by September of 1806. So 1806 is the easiest year of the expedition. There's just one bit of violence along the way in which they have a brush with the Blackfoot. Blackfoot are not happy that this expedition has established friendly relations with the Shoshone, who are the enemies of Blackfoot. So they try to steal some horses and guns from one wing of the expedition, and it will lead to the death of 2 of the Blackfoot. So this is a bit out of sequence. This shows Lewis and Clark encountering the Shoshone for the first time. The expedition had just 1 death, which was remarkable, given a journey of nearly 2.5 years through very difficult environments, some tense moments with the Lakota and with the Blackfoot. Only 1 death. He was not killed by Indians. He's killed by a ruptured appendix in August of 1804. He's a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant. His last name was Floyd. So this is a real testament to the leadership of the expedition, and then and to the high quality of the men who were involved in it, that they were able to follow sanitary procedures that were often elusive to military groups in the early 19th century, and is able to keep their cool in some tense moments, and to go through some very difficult waterways, difficult mountains, and to have just 1 death. It's really extraordinary. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody dies, and that 2 Blackfoot died. Here is a painting done a little bit later of Blackfoot Indians. So one of the points I want to say as I come to wrap this up is that the Lewis and Clark expedition succeeds in making friendly contact and enduring contact with some Native peoples who will remain American allies for many decades after that, including the Mandans and the Shoshone. But in the course of choosing some Indian friends, they are making other Indians their enemies. And that included the Lakota and the Blackfoot, who both of those groupings of Native peoples would have very hostile relations with the United States most of the time. So the pattern of alliances and enmity really takes shape with the Lewis and Clark expedition and will have a very enduring form. The other thing the expedition does is it figures out what the interior North America really looks like, and it's not the fantasy land of low Rocky Mountains easy to get through. Here is a map produced based on the information from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and you can see just those tortuous chains of mountains that one has to get through to get to the Pacific overland. So it turns out this is not a commercially viable route, and won't be a commercially viable route until you get the railroad in the 1860s. So in a way, the expedition dashes hopes that you'll be able to easily get goods from the East Coast across the continent to the Pacific Northwest, build ships and go on to China. It's still the most viable route is still to go around the tip of South America in a sailing ship and go on up the whole length of the Pacific Ocean to trade. That's much more viable than this overland route will be. But what the expedition does do is it reveals this interior landscape with all of these streams and rivers in great detail in the mountains, and it's abounding in fur-bearing animals, not sea otters, but beavers. And so in the wake of this expedition, and indeed some of the men that were part of the expedition will return as fur traders and trappers and will initiate the group that we call the Mountain Men, which is a direct consequence of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And they will bring the American impact into that corner of the world in an even bigger way during the 18 teens and 20s and 30s. Finally, I just want to say something more about York. York comes back, he thinks he's a free man. William Clark literally makes it painfully evident that he is not a free man. Years later, they will reach something of an understanding, and Clark will belatedly free York and will provide him with some seed capital to enter a teamster business back in the vicinity of Louisville, Kentucky, which is where this statue can be found. It was put up in very recent years to honor York as a participant in the Lewis and Clark expedition. Life doesn't end all that well for York. It ends well that he gets to become free, and for a while is closer to his wife who lived in Louisville. But the wife's master moved that enslaved woman away and took her to Mississippi. And York, in an attempt to reunite with her, leaves Louisville, but will die probably of cholera on the way there. And we don't know the exact time that this happened, but it was by 1832 when William Clark tells a visitor that York has died. So I'll wrap up there. And again, the two chief takeaways that I would like to convey to you is that the expedition does provide a significant marker that the United States has a claim in the Pacific Northwest. And it does reveal the pattern of Native American relationships and the geography of the interior of the West from the upper Mandan villages on west through the Rocky Mountains into the Pacific Northwest. So with that, I'll conclude. And we have another poll question, which I think Ashley will put up. Which of the following did the Lewis and Clark expedition achieve? Choice 1 is revealed the potential fur trade of the Rocky Mountains. 2 is created a commercially viable route across the continent to the Pacific. And 3 is befriended all the Indian nations of the interior. And the overwhelming majority has gotten it right. It revealed the potential fur trade of the Rocky Mountains because the route really wasn't commercially viable until you get a much later technology that was not on anybody's radar in 1804. And the route that ultimately would pass successfully through the Rocky Mountains was significantly south of where Lewis and Clark went. It was a place that was called South Pass in what is now Wyoming. And it is South Pass that is the route for the Oregon Trail and the California Trail. And then the Transcontinental Railroad would actually go a bit to the south of that. Okay, so I welcome your questions. I believe that Althea is going to
I'm back.
to me.
Alan, thank you so much. Thanks for that great in-depth overview of Lewis and Clark expedition. Also, thanks for sharing knowledge about York. Many were curious about him, so thank you for that. And so you're ready for some questions, huh?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All right. I think maybe the very first question, did Jefferson feel like the expedition was a success?
He did. Now, he was a little frustrated with Meriwether Lewis because Meriwether Lewis was supposed to pull together the journals for publication. And Jefferson wanted publication yesterday. And that didn't happen. Meriwether Lewis was having some psychological difficulties in his last years of life. And it was very, very difficult for him to concentrate on this particular project. So it just wasn't happening. And it created some friction between he and Jefferson. But because Jefferson's very eager to say, look, we did just what the Captain Cook did. They published his journals. We're going to publish your journals. So they eventually did get published, but it was in the 18 teens, and it was after Meriwether Lewis's death. But Jefferson's very happy with this expedition, very happy with some of the things that were brought back, and many of them ended up in Monticello in the front hallway there. Jefferson is very proud of this expedition and is very happy with William and Clark and all the soldiers. So everybody gets a bonus. And both Clark and Lewis got promotions.
Very good. Very good. Thanks for answering that question. Here's another one. Why is Lewis's first leg from Pittsburgh down the Ohio River to pick up Clark left out of so many discussions about the expedition?
Right. Well, we frame the expedition, and that's a good question. We frame the expedition in terms of when they leave places securely under American control, which would be St. Louis. And so the preliminaries of getting down the Ohio River, hundreds of people had done that before. It's a routine thing to do. Now, of course, preparing for an expedition, assembling the men, assembling the supplies, assembling the weapons, getting the right kind of boats, all of that is extremely important. And often, as the question suggests, that gets short shrift because you ordinarily in accounts, we just see the expeditionaries launching off with all the preparations already well behind them.
Unfortunate, huh?
Well, the more you know about the expedition, the more interesting it becomes. And the logistics are a key part of it. It's not just an adventure story, it's also an organizational story.
Yeah, it took a lot to pull all the pieces together to make it happen.
Yes, indeed.
Exactly. Was Jefferson justified or entitled to expanding the nation's boundaries across the territory that clearly was inhabited by Native people, Native American?
Right. Well, Jefferson thought so. And so Jefferson is playing this game that's been played with European imperial powers in North America. They'd long been in the habit of laying claim to territories that in fact were inhabited and long possessed by Native peoples. So there was a tendency to dismiss the sovereignty of Native peoples, to take it lightly, and to cast them as a stereotype, as being primitive savages. Now, sometimes you could cast them as noble savages, but Thomas Jefferson, the other leaders of the United States, the leaders of Britain, France, Spain, except for a few literary figures, all regard the Indians as having an inferior level of civilization and lacking all of the attributes of sovereignty. They insist on this. Now, I'm talking about belief. I'm not necessarily talking about reality.
Right.
It's a powerful thing. And so Jefferson just believes that Native cultures are, in the long run, doomed. And as he saw it, the United States had a responsibility to try to facilitate Native peoples giving up their cultures and giving up their claims to sovereignty and becoming absorbed, not just within the bounds of the United States, but within the body of the American people, literally. he was a big believer in intermarriage between native peoples and non-native peoples. And he assumed that native peoples would cease to exist, that they're biologically, they would be their descendants, but they would be mixed in race with the American people, and that their cultures wouldn't exist anymore. And he felt that this was necessary as a security measure, in part for the United States, because he saw independent native peoples as potential allies of American enemies, especially the British. So Jefferson felt that he was entitled to expand the United States in this way and to absorb native peoples thoroughly. As you could well imagine, native peoples didn't agree with him.
Now, Alan, if McKenzie described the difficulties of crossing the mountain, why did Jefferson assume crossing the mountain would be so easy?
That's also a good question. Wishful thinking. McKenzie had speculated in his book that maybe the Rocky Mountains were not as thick and high and difficult to get through further south. Just speculation. He has no way of knowing this. He asked an Indian leading question. They said, sure, this is the worst part of it. Tough luck for you, buddy. But it turns out that's a little bit true. The Canadian Rockies are worse to get through than the American Rockies. But the American Rockies turn out not to be the kind of cakewalk that people wanted to believe. And part of it is there was a belief in symmetry. And Jefferson shared in this. He thought, we got the Appalachian Mountains here in the east. We know there's some mountains in the west. They got to be just like the Appalachian Mountains. So it's a kind of mode of thinking that unfortunately the Enlightenment was open up to, that they like to believe that there was balance and symmetry and order in nature, and that things might not work that way didn't really register with them. So hence the optimism.
Very optimistic.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple more. What contributed to Lewis's mental problems, and when was it first realized or noticed?
Yeah, it's very tough to say when it was first realized. And a lot of it has to do with how you define mental difficulties. It was evident, I think, in retrospect that, and again, I'm not a professional psychologist, and so I'm just repeating the range of speculation by reasonably well-informed people looking at the evidence. And I've not directly investigated this question myself. So big caution here. I don't even play a doctor on television. There's some signs that scholars have found that Lewis and Clark was prone to being manic depressive. That he was prone to what was called great enthusiasms, bursts of enthusiasm, then prone to periods in which he's melancholy, as the language would be. Does it impair his performance of his duties during the expedition? I don't know of it ever doing so. It's entirely speculative that maybe one of the reasons why Lewis very much wanted William Clark along as a co-commander was that Lewis knew his own limitations. That there would be times when he would need, somebody else to take charge of things. This is pure speculation, okay? But I think it's plausible.
Okay.
After he came back, he's given a more responsible position and a more political position. He will end up being the governor of Upper Louisiana, which is now the Missouri Territory. And William Clark is made the American Superintendent for Indian Affairs in that corner of the world. And it turns out Meriwether Lewis is a guy who's perfectly capable of administering a group of about 40 men, in other words, a company in the army. He's not good at administering a whole colony in his budget. And there's some budgetary problems, which almost certainly are not corruption, but do show that Meriwether Lewis was in over his head. Mm-hmm. And then he's stressed out that Jefferson's saying, when are we going to get these journals? And he's going back to Washington to try to address questions about his financial management of Upper Louisiana. And this is in 1809. And on the way, it is known as a fact that he tried to commit suicide at one point and was restrained. And then a couple of weeks later, he dies in his room of gunshot. Now, some people have wanted to speculate that maybe it was robbers came in, maybe somebody else had a reason to, that maybe Lewis was going to reveal something. And people who are prone to conspiracy theories are prone to see his death as a murder, either by robbers or by people trying to keep something secret. And it varies depending on the conspiracy theory, what that secret would be. I don't really see the evidence pointing that way. There's evidence he was suicidal. There's no evidence that anybody else was in his room at the time. So it's just a very tragic story.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Okay, Alan, here's another question along the same lines. Can you speak about Benjamin Rush's contribution to healthcare, the aspects of the expedition?
Again, medical aspects is not my forte. It's certainly the case that Benjamin Rush is a friend of Thomas Jefferson's. There are correspondence. And he's considered the leading medical expert. He's based in Philadelphia. So Jefferson certainly consulted him because Jefferson believes he's going to the top. Now, Benjamin Rush, a lot of the things Benjamin Rush believed in turned out not to be very sound medical science. And so, which is not to say that he's always wrong. It's just that he's wrong a lot. So I'm not sure I would be inclined to give Benjamin Rush a whole lot of credit for the overall health of the expedition. But again, there are people who have done more work on Benjamin Rush than I have, who might answer it differently.
All right, here's a big one for you. Can you talk about the various disappointments of the expedition?
Well, certainly that it's, yeah, it's certainly the case that getting through the Rocky Mountains is a lot more difficult. And they get caught in a snowstorm, a very severe storm. And when you get caught in a snowstorm in the Upper Rockies, we're not talking about inches of snow, we're talking about feet. So that's a real touch and go moment that happens in September. So the fact that this is not a commercially viable route is disappointing. For them, having to eat salmon I mean, many of us might say, yeah, bring it on. I'd love to be eating that Pacific Northwest salmon on a regular basis, but they found that a bit disappointing. They sort of thought that they would be able to return with a lot of sea otter pelts, and they get some, but not a whole lot. And having to go back through the mountains means you can't carry that much. So that's a little disappointing. But I would say, on balance, these pretty small disappointments compared to their sense of accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. So, Alan, about how much was the overall cost of the expedition?
Oh, I really don't know. I guess I should know that, but I don't. The budgetary figures for what gets allocated by Congress is certainly publicly available. The degree to which there are cost overruns, which I'm pretty sure there were, I also don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay, and your opinion, would our world be slightly different if Lewis and Clark had not taken this expedition?
Oh, historians are terrible with these counterfactuals. Comfortable because we just try to figure out how history really did turn out as best we can, and that's tough. That this expedition got through at this particular period of time, 1803 to 1806, means that the initiation of the fur trade beyond the upper Missouri into the Rocky Mountains will happen much earlier than if that expedition hadn't happened. And it is these so-called mountain men who will find South Pass and will figure out virtually every nook and cranny of the Rocky Mountains and the Great Basin. And it is those group of men in association with the native peoples who would help them, especially the Shoshone, that is the real key to the United States being able to send significant numbers of people to the Pacific coast during the 1840s. So if the Lewis and Clark expedition had not happened in Jefferson's administration, it seemed much less likely that a later president would have authorized an expedition of this kind of sort. Now, there were, of course, government-sponsored expeditions that were done, but they're mostly come about during the 1830s and 40s. There's all sorts of conflict with Britain. The War of 1812 will break out, and that would have made this kind of expedition difficult to impossible, because the United States needed every spare soldier to fight further to the east. So that it went when it did, took the form that it did, that it succeeded the way it did, is something that is going to dramatically accelerate the American exploitation of the economic potential of the Rocky Mountain region, the Great Basin, and will open the way for a more significant occupation, permanent occupation by people who will engage in mining and farming in California and Oregon. And so all of those are key developments in the fulfillment of ambitions by many Americans to try to control the biggest chunk of the continent.
Here's a question for you, Alan. What is William Clark's relationship to George Rogers Clark? Any relationship?
Okay, I think he's a nephew. I know he's related. It's possible he's a cousin, but I think he's a nephew. He's not the son, I don't think. But this is something where I will defer to Wikipedia, what it says there. But there are relatives. George Rogers Clark, of course, had been a key military figure during the American Revolution, and Virginia's laying claim to territories to the west. And Thomas Jefferson at one point had tried to interest George Rogers Clark in leading an expedition to the Pacific coast. But George Rogers Clark was feeling too old and had all sorts of ailments, including a drinking problem that made that impossible.
Alan, what types of trade goods did Lewis and Clark carry with them on this expedition?
Well, they take along some mirrors, some jewelry, some cloth, a fair amount of cloth. They bring some gunpowder, a lot of tobacco, knives, hatchets. They're bringing along some silver medals with the picture of Thomas Jefferson on it and a symbol of friendship, shaking hands. And these silver medals are given away to anybody that Lewis and Clark considered to be a native leader who is either helpful or could be helpful in the future.
Very good. Did Lewis and Clark travel through Washington, Kentucky, the most westward post office?
I don't know. They went along the Ohio River, and I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that particular place.
Okay. It was remarkable how they prepared for the expedition, especially what they took. How do you think they were able to consider what was ahead of them? Another crystal ball?
Well, no, it's the McKenzie Journal. You know, McKenzie's gone where they want to go. Now, he's gone with a smaller group of men, and most of the people in his expedition were Native Americans or they were French-Canadian boatmen. So Mackenzie's operation is much smaller. But Mackenzie's figured out what kind of trade goods do the Native peoples in that corner of the world like. What kind of foods do you need to bring along with you? You know, knowing about pemmican was extremely important. Pemmican is a combination of dried berries and dried meat pounded together. It's kind of like beef jerky, except it's a bit better for you because the berries are in it. And pemmican is a key thing that's developed by Native peoples in the upper Missouri Valley, elsewhere in the Great Plains, made out of buffalo meat. And so knowing that you should be very nice to the Native women who make this stuff and engage in trade on terms that will be pleasing to them so you can get them to provide you with pemmican, that's the kind of knowledge that you could find out reading Alexander Mackenzie's journal. So the expedition, one of the key things will be to get a supply of pemmican so that when they get away from living buffalo, when they get away from the Missouri River and they get up in the Rocky Mountains, they're going to need to eat something. It's going to have to be compact. And they don't want to be hauling the bulky barrels of salted pork, which was
Right.
the primary thing that people in the American military ate. You don't want to be carrying barrels over the Rocky Mountains. Pemmican is much more compact and a lot more nutritious per weight than is salt pork. So that's an example of the kind of prior information in which Alexander McKenzie had been a real resource for them.
Very good. When they returned to Missouri, could they use the same boats that they journeyed, that they took for the expedition? How'd they get back?
When they get to the Columbia River and they go down, they have to build new boats. And then there are boats to go as far upstream as they can go. When they got back to the Missouri River, I assume, under this assumption, that they had hidden their boats and used them again. That's a guess. So I would encourage you to go to another source to find out exactly what they used for the boats. Now, one of the boats that they started out with from St. Louis turned out to be very bulky and not very good for its purpose. So they basically abandoned that one.
Okay. Alan, we're almost out of time. Let me find one more question for you. Did Lewis and Clark send reports back during the journey?
They did from the Mandan villages. So they were able to send messages back to Jefferson to fill him in on how things had gone so far. So that will be the winter of 1804 to 1805. Once they get going in the spring of 1805, then they're out of touch with Jefferson and other Eastern leaders.
Very good. Alan, thank you so much. This was a great first day. We had some difficulty with your sound, so we'll work on that with you right after this program and try to make it better for tomorrow. Audience, thank you so much for being with us. I'm sure you enjoyed the Q&A, even if you missed some of what Alan said earlier. So Alan, thank you so much. And audience, thanks for being here. Tomorrow's talk, that's Wednesday, June 16th at 3 p.m. Please tune in for our World of Change, the Native American West before Lewis and Clark. And our speaker for tomorrow is Colin Calloway, and he'll be speaking tomorrow, and Alan will moderate his conversation at the end of his talk. We still have spaces available. If you haven't registered for that talk, feel